I have Ruth here, and again, before I introduce her, her dad, Joe Addis, sold on the streets of New York this peeler, which is very dear to me because I first saw this being sold back in 1988 by one of my neighbors at the Perth Royal Show, and I brought a sample back, and because it kind of conflicted with another business I was doing with the slicer and the peeler, I gave this to my friend Jeff. And Jeff, coincidentally enough, was also a gentleman and with not a hair out of place. And he sold this until he passed away years ago. And then, of course, it came back into my possession, and I sold it for years. Joe Addis is a legend in the business from 19 in the 90s. He sold this on the streets of New York City. And I mean, to call him a street vendor would be an insult because your dad was so much more than that. He was a showman, and he modeled himself, back when he was 15 years old, I believe, Manchester, England. He dropped out of school. He was I believe he was the son of the seventh son or seven sons of a widow.
Seventh child, yeah, seventh child.
And so he quit school, worked in some firm, and they sent him to go post a letter. Joe saw at this bomb site, I think, that this market sprung up, and he was watching all these guys, of course, a lot older than himself, pitching their wares from jewelry to eyeglass cleaner to so many things. And he looked at him and goes, he was amazed because he went, they're showmen. And that took your dad on a journey that lasted right up until the day he passed, which I believe was February 3rd, was it? 2009?
February 1st.
Yes, February
2009.
After my happy birthday. Well, I've been following Joe for years on YouTube. I've read about him in Vanity Fair. You can as well. You can look him up. I have with me Ruth Ades, the daughter of Joe. And I am so glad you've taken this time, thank you, to talk about your dad.
It's a pleasure. My favorite subject to talk about. So
I can only imagine. Before we get into the nitty gritty, I can only imagine him at a dinner table. Tell me what it was like to have dinner with your dad.
So, well, I'll tell you a funny story. Not long after the Vanity Fair piece came out. So the man who wrote that piece, Howard Kaplan, his name is, he knew the owner of the publisher of Vanity Fair. And he also, I'm trying to remember his name now. Anyway, it'll come to me. He also had a part in a restaurant, very, very busy, popular restaurant in the Village around the corner from where I live, called the Village Inn. And anyway, and all the celebrities came, and even to be able to make a reservation, there was like a private phone number. It was all very exclusive. So Howard arranged for a dinner there. And we're all like looking. So I think there were probably about 5 or 6 of us having dinner. And he loved good restaurants, my dad. And, I remember he ordered Dover Sole. So we're like looking for celebrities, and people are coming into the restaurant and they're all like looking at my dad. It was so funny, because he was such a familiar face,
yes,
around New York, because he didn't just work at the Green Market, Union Square. He worked all over. He worked in Brooklyn. He worked downtown near the City Hall. He worked Midtown. His favorite phrase about working, especially the street, was he loved the glorious uncertainty of it.
Yes.
Because he'd walk out every day with no idea what would happen to him. There could be days when he'd like struggle. He'd keep getting moved by the cops all day long. Yes. And then finally, he'd sit there and like take, I don't know, $500 in an hour or something. There were other days when he'd get nicked, he'd get arrested, and then have to go the next morning to court and end up being fined, which, by the way, he just considered the rent. That was rent. He was a great storyteller. and loved to tell stories about graft and about what he'd done. He was deaf in one ear, and as he used to say, I'm deaf in one ear, can't hear out the other. So in some situations, he couldn't hear so well. But he had after a few glasses of red wine, he would become quite vociferous. And that's what the last thing that he ever wanted when he sold in the street was for anybody to feel sorry for him. It was never anything like that. And again, that he got from his peers in England. Like they all dressed beautifully.
Yes.
All the grafters, all the street traders, they'd put a suit and tie, a good overcoat on, and go to work, or not, or go to the betting shop, or and it was and the other thing was because there was always this competition and race between them and the bobbies, the cops.
Yes.
It always made them feel better, to be and really superior to these cops who arrested them and then went home and ate egg and chips for dinner while they'd be eating in the Savoy restaurant, the restaurant of the Savoy. So, and that book lays out beautifully a kind of hierarchy of street workers too.
Yes.
So you had the fruit and veg workers, and then you had the grafters, and there was a whole list. And he gave me a copy of it, and he wrote an inscription in it, and just wrote, you'll find me on page 32. I know what the first few things were. I know that he sold a string shopping bag. And to demonstrate the strength of this string shopping bag, you fill it up with cans,
yes.
Peas and fruit or whatever. And all the punters thought that he was selling cans of fruit.
Right. Yes.
Yeah. But so when he first went to work, the people who most caught his attention were the old run-out workers.
Yes.
As you call the jam workers.
Yes, the jam auctioneers.
Yeah, and that's what really fascinated him, because it was so much about the language.
I have to just for those that aren't familiar, because the jam auctioneers, or the confidence game, as it was known back in the day as well, is totally, you won't see it anymore. It's against the law. But back when I first got into this business, there was Freddie Hunter and Jack Hunter, and there was Nick, and there was a lot of these people that would do a pitch. It was like a truck would show up, or it was a closed door auction on Yonge Street. We had it. And what they did is they built your confidence up. And an example of that would be, they would ask how many people in the crowd smoke, and people would put up their hands, because back then everybody smoked. And then they would take lighters and say, here, open your bag, have a lighter, have one, they're free. And they're just building your confidence. And then they'd start selling you things, but with the kind of the guise of, you were going to get either some of it or all of it back, right? And so your dad was, when I found out this, which is just recently, I gained a whole new other respect for him, because that is that is a pitch amongst pitchmen, and again, your dad was a grafter, he was a spruiker, he was a barker, he was a pitchman, he was a showman. But to be a jam auctioneer, tell me what you know about that.
Yeah, so well, he worked the jam on all different kinds of settings. He worked off trucks and markets. They rented halls back then. This was in the 50s. Hand out leaflets to get people in. That was like the the way of pitch getting back then. And then there were also the shops, and they'd usually rent the shop for a few months at a time, because eventually they always go crooked. And so they work with very short leases. And he worked all over the whole British Isles, actually, because he worked Ireland as well. And then he went to Australia. So he went to Australia in 69. And that was really when I mean, he used to tell me about the run out when I was little, and I kind of understood it even back then, and and he told it with all kinds of humor and just the mischief of it and the brilliance, and I kind of got it.
Yes.
And then when we went to Australia, he went to Australia first and worked the run out. It had never been seen before in Australia.
Yes.
So it was like, it was like the streets were paved with gold. And he worked a run of shows and fairs all the way up along the Barrier Reef, up that Queensland coast. And then we came back, and he then had a shop in King's Cross in Sydney. And this was a gold mine, because King's Cross was like a mini Times Square. Everybody used to come to King's Cross eventually. Foreign tourists from the tiniest little sheep shearing towns in Australia, and they'd come with pockets full of money because they had nothing to spend it on, And and it was a small shop. Actually, I just walked by it just last week because I was in Sydney, and
Yes.
I saw the place where it was. And so about 2/3 of the way into a run out pitch, you have everybody in, and you've kind of sifted through who's going to be a likely punter and who may be wise to it, and so there's a method called the nailer. So you use the nailer to nail them in, and then the doors are closed, and then you'd go to work on who was left. Of course, the wheat are they're the lucky ones, the privileged ones who are going to be part and parcel of the propaganda proceedings. He sold on markets. He sold a lot of bedding. Okay. As well, and he loved selling it like textile, towels and sheets and bedspreads and all of that. And he would sell, mounted, I guess off the side of a truck. And so, yeah, he sold bedding. He also had a couple of shops. He didn't always work crooked tools, he worked. I mean, for him, the peeler was the straightest tool he ever worked. Kind of laughed about the fact that the last thing that he sold, it was almost with the run out, like the main goal is to leave it sweet, for there to be no nauseas, no knocks at the end of it.
Yes.
And really at the end of his life with the peeler, he left it sweet.
Yes. Yes.
And left people like happy with what they'd got. It was 1987. And in so I was at Columbia University at the time. I was studying. So, what do you do on your summer vacation? The previous years, I'd go and shill for my dad, who was working a 20-pound lot of jewelry outside Harrods, which, was, just talk about glorious uncertainty. And just a little side thing here. There's an official photograph of Harrods, not a photograph, a postcard of Harrods. And sure enough, there's my dad sitting in the doorway. And you can pick out, Darky Pat, his name was, his outside man, and a bunch of Irish gypsies who sold the heather, who he was friends with, heather for your luck. Heather. But anyway, that's a side thing. So 1987, summer comes along. Okay, Dad, I've got my job as usual. He says, no, this year you're gonna have your own firm. So he organized, I think, 4 shills and a couple of lookouts. One of the lookouts was cross-eyed, actually, as I remember. And I was working perfume. We call it the funkum in England, and it was 4 bottles of perfume. They weren't like knockoffs. They had fancy names, Maison de l'Enclos, whatever. And sold 4 out of cardboard boxes on the floor, and it was 4 for £10. And I was, down at the bottom rung. There were street traders all up and down Oxford Street, and I was, the newcomer, so I had like the crappy end of Oxford Street. Anyway, so I've says to Dad, like before when he called me, he says, no, you have your own firm. And I said, but Dad, I'll get arrested. And he's just gone, oh, you'll get used to it, he says.
Wow.
So I went back to work, and that evening, we'd all the grafters would meet in a pub in the George in London, in the West End.
Yes.
And he said, now the worst thing that can happen to you.
Right.
And leave it outside. He'd go in the bathroom, scrub his hands, because all the potato peelings. And he always carried a clothes brush in the bag, because there'd be all potato juice and carrot, bits of carrot, all over his suit. So he'd like shave, brush off the suit and everything, give his shoes a bit of a brush. He always wore sneakers, by the way, as well. He wore these, $2,000 Chester Barry suits from London with a pair of New Balance sneakers, because he'd be walking miles, and in London it was like literally running away from the cops. I mean, he'd get the up from the lookout, and it'd be down in the tube station, or running into whatever doorway or whatever. It was fun and games. It was all fun fun and games. Good time.
Oh, that's so fantastic. You yourself, because he left you as part of your inheritance, he left you how many cases?
He left me 40 cases of peelers.
40 cases with 500 in each case.
And I had never worked the peeler. I was a bit, I'd worked the chamois for years. I'd worked the pens. What else did I work? I tried to work the slicer, and I was useless on the slicer. The iron I'd worked, a few other, but I loved the chamois. The chamois was my favorite. I loved it. And I worked with some of the best in the country.
Yes.
And but the peeler also was so much his personality, and his whole, the way he presented himself. And it was like a package almost. But he used to say to me, you've got to work the peeler. He says, like, I'll work one plot, you work the other, and you just sit in the kitchen with a bucket and a pile of potatoes and just practice, and you'll be fine. And yeah, Dad, Anyway, when he died, I mean, I think a week after, I went down to Union Square. My brother was here, and he came down as well. And I kind of, I did practice with a bucket. Mm-hmm. And of course, the first couple of pitches, I've like dropped the potato, and all I can see is my dad looking down, like,
that's right.
Out, you got to hold it properly. And so I took to it pretty quickly. But I was at that time, I had 3 kids in school, and I couldn't afford to get arrested every so often. Although I did one day from Union Square, I went. They didn't let me work on the green market for a time, so I was on the street, and sure enough, the Alpha Squad, who are the New York City squad specifically for street vendors, and they nicked me. They took me in the van. And again, they knew Dad. They said, don't worry, we'll take you in. We won't keep you long. We know, you're his daughter. And then I'm supposed to pick the kids up from school.
Well, I'm sure your dad looked down upon that day and was just so proud.
Yeah, I think he would have been. And every word, like I would always imagine. And the thing about my dad, that he taught me too, really, is, about pitching, and every good pitchman knows this, is that you never stop thinking about what you're doing.
Right.
And you think every single word, there's a reason for every word, every action, every pause.
Yes.
There's a reason for it. And he's saying, know why you're doing it, know?
Yes.
And
again, a good showman like your dad. I mean, your dad disliked, as I disliked, as any good pitchman or showman would dislike, being called, gee, you're a great salesman. Because I, from when I was little, I never wanted to be in sales. To this day, I want to be in sales. But I look at, like, a salesman would say, for example, it's raining outside. And not to take anything away from being a really good salesman, like, all kudos to them. They're great salesmen, and they deserve all the accolades. But a showman will say, it's raining outside, you know.
Right, exactly.
It's more of a play in miniature with beginning, middle, end, you know.
Absolutely, it's theater. Absolutely,
And
absolutely.
one of my pet peeves is when a pitchman says, like I said before, and like if you said it before, why are you saying it again? And why are you telling people you're saying it again? So like you said, each word, each sentence has to be choreographed, and there has to be a reason for it.
Yeah.
That's why I was in such awe of your dad, because he was a true showman.
Yeah, he was. And especially the street, because with the street, you're not vulnerable, but you have to, use every skill. And another really important thing, there seems to be a kind of tendency with, let's say, amateur salesmen and women to say, to start shouting to try and get attention, and he always said, no, you work with your head. You start off, you pull the pitch with your head down, and you work quietly. And you work down, you sit down, you don't stand up, you sit down. And so you're creating a mystery and you're creating curiosity. Exactly.
Yes.
Exactly.
Well,
so all of those, so many.
I've watched every video. I've watched every special. Was it Inside Edition? There was somebody else that did a story on him, but I've seen so many documentaries on him and Vanity Fair articles and stuff. So there's plenty of for people. Joe Addis, you Google it, and there's plenty to watch. And it really is fascinating. Your dad was a legend, Ruth. I want to thank you for taking
It's a pleasure. And it's a pleasure to talk to you, Larry, and hear your stories as well.
We have so many mutual friends that I think should mention. Maggie Mullen, one of my dearest, oldest friends in the business.
Right, dear friend. And Leanna, of course.
Leanna, of course.
Leanna, I love. Yes.
And Wally Nash, who I know you knew from.
Yeah, I haven't seen Wally for years, but we used to.
Well, when I announced that I was going to be doing this, it's amazing how many came out of the woodwork and actually spoke. I mean, a lot of people will watch my videos without saying anything, but it's amazing how many people came out and go, let me know when Ruth is on. And so I've been looking forward to it.
I'm flattered. That's lovely.
Ruth, thank you so much.
Thank you. And maybe we'll meet in person. Come down to New York. Actually, I have cousins in Toronto. Yeah, absolutely.
Okay.
Absolutely.
Thanks again, Ruth.
Bye. Pleasure. Bye.